Hello, I'm Spencer Cox, Governor of Utah. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to join this great cross-partisan panel on federalism, but I do want to share some remarks about this topic, as well as bring to light another topic that's important to me, governing better by learning how to disagree better. We're all exhausted by the polarization and divisive forces plaguing our politics. As chair of the National Governors Association, I've launched an initiative that focuses on finding healthy, productive ways to manage conflict instead of retreating into partisan camps. This theme, healthy conflict, is so important to me that I appeared in a TV ad with Governor Jared Polis, a Democrat of Colorado and vice chair of the NGA. In my view, federalism is one of the devices that our founding fathers included in our constitutional system as a way of managing political conflict. Federalism respects the idea that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to making policy in a large, diverse nation like ours. But guess what? Federalism won't work properly if hyper-partisan politics take over every level of government across the nation. I'm sure if you polled elected officials, most of them would say things have gone too far when it comes to divisive partisanship. And all of them would decry the rise in attack ads and the billions of dollars being spent to divide Americans. I've made it a promise to do my best not to attack my political opponents personally, and it's one I intend to keep. American Promise is one of those organizations that aims to unite people across the political spectrum around a common goal without name-calling or shunning due to political party affiliation. And this goal is a noble one: to tone down the rhetoric in our politics, return to civility, and let the states and Congress decide what regulations are needed in our broken campaign finance system. I look forward to working with American Promise on potential solutions, and I hope you give them and today's panelists a solid look for the work they are doing.
We thank Governor Cox for that inspiring message. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel, the speakers who are joining me on stage for this conversation. So first I'll start with Stephen Richer on my left. He is the elected Maricopa County Recorder. He is statutorily responsible for document recordation, voter registration, and early voting in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is home to 4.6 million residents and the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States. Stephen previously worked as a business person and a transactional attorney. Stephen received his BA from Tulane University and his MA and JD from the University of Chicago. Stephen was named Arizonan of the Year by the Arizona Republic in 2021, Republican Politician of the Year by the Phoenix New Times in 2021, and Public Lawyer of the Year by the Maricopa County Bar Association in 2022. To my right is Secretary Corey Stapleton. He's a former Republican state senator and Secretary of State from Montana. He certified the 2020 presidential election for his state. Woo. Prior to politics, Secretary Stapleton was a surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy, deploying overseas on the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy and Aegis cruiser USS Hue City. Secretary Stapleton graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with an engineering degree and completed master's degrees in political science and financial services at Temple University and the American College, respectively. He is a registered investment advisor in Billings, Montana, and a Nashville country music recording artist.
Let's go. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
To my immediate left, Brian Boyle is Executive Director and General Counsel at American Promise.
Woo!
Where he is overseeing the legal and civic strategy for proposing and ratifying the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Brian received his BA from Harvard College and his JD from Cornell Law School. Brian is a big believer in local government. He previously served on Governor Charlie Baker's Local Government Advisory Commission and is currently a member of the Select Board in his town. Unfortunately, Kansas City, Missouri Mayor Quentin Lucas was unable to travel to Los Angeles this week, and he sends his regrets because he was really looking forward to being with us today. So once again, please welcome our panelists. So to kick things off, I'd like you all to consider the following conceptual overview of federalism. Harvard professor Danielle Allen has explained, as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention deliberated on the design of the new Constitution, one of the topics they focused on was which functions should be assigned to a national government and which to state government. The goal was to ensure alignment between governance and the population affected by the relevant process of governance. So federalism is the term we use to refer to the pattern of structural features in the Constitution that reflect the idea that different levels of government should have different powers and responsibilities. First, the states continue to exist and function as states, with their own powers and sphere of authority. Second, the powers of the national government are specifically enumerated and thus limited. And third, federalism is built into the structure of the national government. For example, each state has 2 senators, regardless of population, but congressional districts are drawn geographically and exist with state lines. So, reflecting on what you have just heard, I want to ask what resonated. Is there anything you would add or subtract? And Stephen, I'd like to begin with you.
Gosh. All right. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Okay, very good. We're off to a better start already. Yay. So whenever I go to Washington, D.C., I like to remind them, so there are these things outside of Washington, D.C. They're called states. There's 50 of them. Remember, they exist. And this has become particularly important in the election context because elections are still very much creatures of state law. And this is increasingly problematic when people are getting their news sources from national news networks or getting it online, because the number one thing that we hear about during election time is, well, I thought the rules were this. Or it happens this way in Florida, why doesn't it happen that way in Arizona? Or I was told in Wisconsin you can't begin tabulating the ballots until 8 p.m. on election night. Why are you already tabulating them? So in this increasingly nationalized news media dynamic, it comes up, butts head with a very federalized system that still exists with respect to election administration. Now that has been helpful and hurtful. The hurtful is we field a lot of those questions. The helpful is that there are 8,000 election jurisdictions in the United States, and we can learn, and we do learn from a lot of those jurisdictions about best practices or legislative changes that we would like to see happen. So yes, the notion of the laboratories of democracy still does happen in the context of election administration in the United States.
All right, thank you. Secretary Stapleton, you have any comments to add?
Not so much on this subject. I would just agree with that. We used to use the term honeycombed. The 50 states are honeycombed, especially with elections. If something goes wrong in one state, Pennsylvania, for example, if their touch screens don't work, the other states aren't necessarily affected. And what changed was Barack Obama, on his way out of office, designated elections as critical infrastructure. And then President Trump continued on that. And so right before our eyes, we had 200 years of history where the states ran the elections as it was anticipated that that's how we would do it. And we've had a lot of strain since then. So the politics has kind of followed that too, and it's really dangerous. I think we'll get into this. But once you start nationalizing everything, then you have all of the money that comes along with it. And what you have is these small offices, council, school boards, whatever, that previously people might raise $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 for, and local issues dominated. Most people in this room would agree that it should be locally driven, right? Suddenly, when you nationalize things, you just push a button. And Mark Zuckerberg doesn't care about a county or a state. It's a national thing now. And big dollars can change the outcomes, because you can come into office and you can come into a state and plop $10,000 down on a school board seat. And the outcome will be determined by and large by the money. And so federalism is incredibly important. It's a term we don't use very much, but the idea that we can have different levels of government, different levels of competency is so critical. I come from a small state, Montana. We have just a million people or so. And when you come from a small state, those of you who do, you're often up against bigger states or people who think like the popular vote should matter for presidential outcomes, right? You don't like the electoral college, we get 3 votes. All of those things. But you got to remember, it's similar to the experience of going to DC and reminding people that local is better, and we really need to work towards that. So it should really be a bipartisan thing. Passion is driven by democracy, but wisdom is driven by institutions, the republic.
Thank you. Brian, what would you add?
Sure. Yeah, I actually want to tell a story, I think, to kind of illustrate. I thought the conceptual overview was great, but we don't often use the word federalism. It's sort of abstract, but it still matters in our lives. So y'all remember there was a pandemic 3 years ago, right? One major piece of legislation that came out of the pandemic was the American Rescue Plan Act. And one of the features of that act was it illustrated federalism in action. So at the national level, there was a recognition by Congress that there was going to need to be an infusion of money into states and localities to keep them afloat while we were still getting through the pandemic. And they made a decision about how that money was actually going to be spent. They didn't say one size fits all. You have to spend it on A, B, and C. They said, we're going to give a chunk of money to each state as a state, and they can kind of decide what makes the most sense in terms of how to deploy those funds in that state. And then they also did something which they had never done, I don't think, in history before, which was they made direct grants to localities, municipalities. And so then those cities and towns got to decide what they needed in order to get through the tumultuous time of the pandemic. So that's like why federalism matters to us on our daily lives. It allowed, like in my town, for example, we spent a lot of our money on COVID tests that we were distributing to seniors who were homebound, right? That was a decision that we made because we knew what we needed. And that is the virtue of federalism. As we get into this panel, I'm going to explain why money in politics is really interfering with the virtues of federalism. But I just wanted to share that story so you could understand, like, federalism isn't just this like wonky thing. It actually is crucial to the way American government works.
All right. Thank you for the concrete illustration. Stephen, when you've seen movements trying to discredit the results of an election, do they tend to be homegrown, or are there outsiders coming in trying to sow doubt and mistrust? And do you see outside money playing a role in that process?
Yes, very much so. In 2021, we had this group called the Cyber Ninjas do a review of Arizona's elections, and we became sort of the international hotspot for election denialism. We had state legislators from around the country. We had Tim Byrne of Overstock.com pouring in a lot of money. Mike Lindell continues to fund a lot of the stuff that happens in Arizona. I am currently on a traveling circuit thanks to the federal government where I am a victim in cases. I had somebody who tried to kill me who lives in Lubbock, Texas, and so I went to Lubbock, Texas. I'm going to the Eastern District of Missouri next month because that's where somebody wanted to kill me. And I'm going to San Diego the month after that. And so I want to respond to these things like, dude, what are you doing? You live in San Diego. Life seems pretty great there, and you're obsessing about elections in Maricopa County and sending me those messages. But that's just sort of the nature of it has become so nationalized that people are focusing in on 5 states and these jurisdictions and these national conversations. But they're doing it without any solid grounding that they would have built up about knowledge in their community from having lived in that community. So do I expect somebody from San Diego to know the ins and outs about Arizona elections? No. But I also don't expect him to pick up the phone and make certain threatening comments. But unfortunately, the way the conversation is happening is all eyes on these counties, all eyes on these states, go to Georgia and do this. And so I think it is having a really corrosive effect on our body politic local because people will then hear from these national players, and increasingly local sentiment is then driven by national sentiment, whether it's the Tucker Carlsons, whether it's the Ben Shapiros, or commensurate people on the left. And that's unfortunate because it loses that sort of rich knowledge that is founded locally.
Secretary Stapleton, I saw an interview with you where you said, we can be different, but we don't have to be mean. And that's a clear affirmation of the cross-partisan ethic that motivates us at American Promise. Tell us how good leadership or structural changes can help us disagree better and encourage healthy policy experimentation in states and cities.
Wow. Well, you can be kind to somebody, and that's not a sign of weakness. We can have manners and still be strong. And what we inherited from generations before us seems to have been lost. And I suspect it has a lot to do with social media. There's going to be a lot of textbooks and a lot of college courses talking about what happened in America from 2008 to 2023, right? From the time that Facebook and Twitter started and the major media died, and we had this turmoil over the last 5 or 6 years. But I think that, I used to say this in the state Senate, that friendships are actually in a legislative body, which could be the Senate, the House, could be the United Nations. Friendships are the cartilage in legislative bodies. And you can operate without cartilage, right? Bone on bone. If you got a knee, you know what I'm talking about. But we've gotten away from, in Washington, D.C., having a culture where people can go out. You know, it was a generation ago when Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would go on a regular basis and have lunch or a beer together, but they'd fight like, you know, dogs during the day. And that's gone. I suspect that we need to get back to that. I don't have the only answer for that. But I do know that in my own experience, when the cartilage breaks down and when the communication ceases between two sides, i.e. a Republican doesn't come to a democracy forum like this, then we begin to make it easy to be tribal. And man, are we tribal in America. And it's not just embarrassing, it's not just humiliating when I think about, you know, I used to travel the world as a naval officer, and, you know, the whole world, when you go to Europe, Italy especially, other nations have an opinion on how we are, and it's usually not good. And they will rant and they will rave and they will tell you how it should be in America, but at the end, then you know they totally admire us and they wish they were us. They're jealous. And that's the way it used to be. And the reason why is we used to communicate. So I think that, you know, we've got to come together. People like all of us here need to use better language. And that means don't be cowards on your keyboards, on your phones. You know, a guy for conducting an election, and it happened in our state too, shouldn't be threatened with his life for tallying up the votes. Shame on the people who fanned those fires. And ultimately, I think history will tell that the third branch of government is going to do its job. They're currently in a few court cases, and by the time the dust settles, the first and second branches got it wrong, and the fourth estate, they went AWOL. But the third branch of government, one of the institutions of federalism, they're going to wipe out those people economically and make sure that what happened in 2020 isn't going to happen again.
So those friendships that you're talking about, we know that one of the reasons that legislators don't make friendships with each other anymore is because they have to spend so much time fundraising. So, Brian, I've seen the language of the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, and I know that the word federalism is included in Section 1 as a compelling sovereign interest. Can you explain why federalism is part of the amendment language, and how does it relate to money in politics?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and also I just want to say thank you to the audience here, because we're about to get a little bit nerdy, but we have to, okay? And I'm going to explain why, right? So, American Promise, we are mission focused on one thing, which is amending the US Constitution. And we have an operating principle that the text that we're supporting is someday gonna be part of the Constitution. So in the past, when amendments have been added, there's been so much conversation around what do the words mean? And the reason that matters is because after it's part of the Constitution, when it comes time for the courts to look back and say, okay, how do we actually construe this? They're gonna actually care what we talk about today. They're gonna care about the questions you ask, because it all goes to establishing what is the public meaning of the text in this amendment. So if you'll bear with me, I just want to read it to you all so we're all on the same page. And I'm also going to make a shameless plug. If you haven't visited the Freedom is Brewing Cafe downstairs, you can get the text of the amendment on your napkin. All right, so just listen and think about this. The 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, Section 1, we the people have compelling sovereign interests in the freedom of speech, representative self-government, federalism, the integrity of the electoral process, and the political equality of natural persons, right? That's Section 1, stating the values that are driving the amendment. Section 2, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to forbid Congress or the states within their respective jurisdictions from reasonably regulating and limiting contributions and spending in campaigns, elections, or ballot measures. So that's the section that basically says to the judiciary, step back, let the policy-making branches make policy when it comes to regulating money in our campaigns and elections. And then Section 3, the last section, Congress and the states shall have the power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation and may distinguish between natural persons and artificial entities. Remember that if you were here this morning and we saw the deep fake and the AI stuff, it's all coming this way. And I don't think we want some court telling us that an artificial intelligence has a right to spend as much money in our elections or have as many ads in our elections as they want. So we could distinguish between natural persons and artificial entities, including by prohibiting artificial entities from raising and spending money in our campaigns, elections, or ballot measures. So that's the whole context, and I just want to briefly drill into the federalism piece. So, and we've alluded to it already, but the money in our system right now, because of the rules that the Supreme Court has decreed over the past 50 years, you can spend unlimited amounts of money in any election, in any jurisdiction. Now, there are some fine details like difference between expenditures and contributions, but the fact is, if you're a billionaire from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you want to spend money in a local election in Utah or Alaska or Kentucky, you can do it, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop you. Now, what our amendment would do is to say, this is actually the type of question that policymakers should be able to think about, formulate policy, experiment with. Now, what American Promise is not suggesting is that it absolutely has to be this way. So we're not going to say, if Utah doesn't want any outside money coming in, then yeah, let's standardize that across the nation. We just want policymakers to have the flexibility to try things out. I'll give you just one quick example. There was a case out of Alaska where the Alaska legislature had tried to pass some basically differential limits on money so that all the outside money wasn't drowning out the actual expenditures from Alaskans themselves. And what the court said is, like, the Supreme Court has told us that you can't do that. And what that really means is that the American people can't do that if we believe it's in our best interest to protect the integrity of our elections. And so with this amendment in place, we would have the ability to set different limits, and we'd be able to tackle the problem of hyper-nationalized politics where you have donor zip codes funneling money into local places that they have no connection to, right? They're not part of the community that really is going to be affected by the decisions made there. They just want to get their way, and they have the money and the power to do it. And we just fundamentally don't think that's the way the American government is supposed to be working.
So I've got a question I'm going to throw out to anyone who wants to address it. Talk about how the concept of federalism has been dismissed in some circles as an impediment to political progress.
Can I follow up on that? Because I'm sitting here and I'm on the ballot again in 2024, and I'm thinking, I don't care what your zip code is if you send me money. Please do it. And I got to imagine that that's how most politicians think. So how do you get sort of political-minded people to say, the system that's worked well for me and that I need to keep working well should be reformed? Because if there's one thing you can count on politicians to agree on, it's to protect themselves and protect the rules of the game that have led to their success. So how do you work around that and the fine people at American Promise?
Yeah, it is a great question, and I will say I actually think it depends on people like you who demonstrate political courage to do things that maybe are going to buck the system. I'm not saying you personally on this issue. I'm saying you have exercised tremendous political courage in ways that don't immediately redound to your self-interest, your immediate self-interest. And I think that, so there's that one piece of it is that, listen, we need to expect more of our elected officials. We need to expect some courage from them. And you all have a role to play in making that happen, right? So that's why our particular strategy leans so heavily on mobilizing grassroots, getting them in the door into those lobbying meetings with their legislators where they look them eye to eye and they say, listen, I know you don't want to be spending all this time raising money. I know you'd rather be out in the community earning votes face-to-face at town hall meetings, kind of the way that it used to be done on a smaller scale. That would be a much better way of winning an election than having to have a war chest that you can use to paper people's mailboxes or buy up all the ads on TV. Everybody is sick of it, and I actually think that the people, and you're totally right, it's hard to opt out of a system that you've figured out, but when we get to that tipping point, let me just say, we call it For Our Freedom, not just because it's for our freedom, it's also for the freedom of the elected representatives. They want to be doing something differently either, and so we got to have their back to do this.
And the perceived downside of federalism in some quarters.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'll just quickly say, in our country, of course, we have had a tradition over time where the basic civil rights and civil liberties of citizens were not uniformly protected throughout the country. And I think one of the major effects of the Civil War amendments, again, it's like these amendments doing the heavy lifting in American history, they applied a basic national standard in terms of what equal rights, right? The Equal Protection Clause and the privileges and immunities of the 14th Amendment. That constitutional amendment actually leveled up federalism by making sure that there was a national floor for every person to have equal rights and equal dignity. And that was not always the case in our country, right? So I'm not gonna say that federalism doesn't have downsides if it's not practiced in a healthy way, or that it hasn't had downsides in the past. But when it's working well, and when we have a healthy federalism, I think it's one of the best things about the American national experiment.
So my role has made me encounter one. So how many of you are familiar with the National Voter Registration Database? Okay, so there is no National Voter Registration Database. Sorry to do that to you. But it's remarkable how many people will say, well, why didn't you know that I moved from Tennessee to Texas if you have the voter registration database? I was like, we have the Maricopa County voter registration database, and sometimes it feels like an entire nation, but it is not a national voter registration database. And prior to this role, I think the civil libertarian in me would have really bristled at the idea of a national voter registration database that's kept by the federal government. But I will tell you that coming into this position and really an emphasis on list maintenance and healthy voter registration protocols, that's one where I'm not as sure that it shouldn't have a national component to it. And I've asked even a lot of sort of pro-election federalism people who are divided on this. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts afterwards if you think we should have a national voter registration database, or if it should be kept as it is currently at the 8,000 voting jurisdictions in the United States, which then keep a statewide voter registration database that they push up to that's required by the Help America Vote Act. But there is no national voter registration database. What there are just a few interstate consortiums, most notably ERIC, which had 33 member states, but has now had some states leaving it because politics is dumb.
Yeah, I come from Texas, where we just pulled out of ERIC. So, Secretary Stapleton, as someone who supports the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, can you share examples of the types of policies that states could try out after the amendment is in place? Perhaps there are examples from your state of Montana?
So to touch on what Brian said, is absolutely true. What we're trying to do is force this back into the legislatures, but it was already and always supposed to be there in the first place, right? The 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. All of the laws are supposed to be made in the states unless it specifically says in the Constitution that the federal government is. I don't think people understand that. We act like it's a big deal that Virginia might do something, or that Arizona might do something, or that Montana might do something, but that's how it's supposed to be, and that's what we're trying to do. The examples are endless, but in my experience, they would be amazing, because the localities and the creativity of thousands of legislators and governors, in my experience, is amazing. You come up with different ideas when you look at things from a local lens. And the percolation of those ideas, when they're good, up to the national level, that's the way it would work. We see it all the time. A lot of the best laws that Congress passes, if they ever get around to doing it, is from an idea that worked well in a certain state. So I wouldn't speculate. I can tell you, for example, Montana, when I ran for the state senate 20-some years ago, the maximum contribution that I could accept from a person, $160. Maximum. And you know what? We all played by that rule. You could get elected 20 years ago in Montana raising $5,000 or $8,000. I raised over $10,000 and it was amazing. I was a shoo-in. Since Citizens United, all of that has changed. The best people are not getting elected to the legislators. The best people are not getting elected to the courts in some cases. The best people are not getting elected to the White House, to the Congresses, to the Senate. We're having people who are entertainers, people with no background in government. Can you imagine another sector, whether it's in sports or business or music, where people with no experience would be elevated to the top rung? I don't care if you're talking about the last president or Kim Kardashian or Oprah Winfrey. You know, the point is that money is destroying our ability to percolate the best ideas and the best people to the top. And so we have a shared interest. I'm not so worried about the hindrances of this Constitution that we inherited. I guarantee you the Roman Empire wishes they had something like our Constitution when it came towards the end, right? It's a braking mechanism. The Constitution and federalism is a braking mechanism that forces us to work through it. And democracy is ugly and it's meant to be. And democracy is hard and it's meant to be. But ultimately, we don't make those critical extinction level events that all great empires and all great countries come to an end. So I don't know about the specifics, but I can tell you when a state passes a law like ours did and everybody plays by it, I could totally see a country where you could run for office, and if you could raise $100,000, you likely could win if you're the best one. If we leveled it all out, if we figured it out. Certain states, Texas, you know, they might want to let their oil do the talking, so maybe they would have higher limits, and maybe other places would have lower limits, and we could battle those out. But the one size does not fit all, and billions of dollars is ruining the American experience. We got to move to we don't want to go back, but we want to go forward to something that's going to work in a digital economy, in an artificial intelligence economy that keeps us still better than the rest of the world and makes the rest of the world continue to emulate not only our Constitution, but our way of life and our way of governing.
So, Brian, how does American Promise envision states setting rules after the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment is passed and ratified?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Secretary Stapleton said is spot on. The states are going to be able to experiment with different policies and see what works best and what makes sense for their citizens. And let me just give you like a hypothetical example using some of the common types of regulations that folks have been thinking about, right? So you can like think about limiting how much people can give or spend. You could also think about disclosure and transparency and making sure however much is being spent is being properly disclosed and you can trace it to like an actual human being. So you could imagine a state saying, you know what, we actually don't mind if somebody wants to spend $1 million of their hard-earned money in an election, maybe as a self-funded candidate, but we absolutely want to know where the money's coming from. We want disclosure and transparency. So a state might pass a policy along those lines. Another state, maybe that has a lot of money pouring from outside the state right now, may say, you know what? We're going to set a differential limit. So we're going to tell our candidates for every, $5 of money that you raise from in-state or in-district, you can only raise one from outside. Maybe they could give that a try. Or they could say, we actually don't care who's spending the money because we're going to say the limits are really low. And so the risk of like corruption or influence or ingratiation and access in our mind is not as great. So there's all these different variations, and I think it just proves the point that like money in politics is complicated. It's always going to be changing. There's always going to be people trying to figure out how to like use the system to their advantage. And typically when we have a complicated policy problem, we want as many tools at our disposal as we can have. But because of the Supreme Court's decisions going back 50 years, we have virtually no tools on the table right now from a policymaking perspective because they've said it has to be a virtually unregulated, complete free-for-all when it comes to money in our elections. So I think there'd be experimentation, and I think states would try different things. And then just the one final point I want to make is states are bound to pass policies that end up actually not working maybe the way that they had hoped, right? And they're like, oh man, that was a bad idea. And guess what? They just pass a new law. That's the solution. So right now, if Justice Kennedy woke up in bed this morning and said, oh man, like what I wrote in Citizens United actually did not work out. Like when I said it's not gonna cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy, I was actually like really wrong. Oh, there's nothing I can do about it now because the Supreme Court isn't going to change that decision or Buckley versus Vallejo. Like literally the only thing that we can do about a bad policy is to amend the Constitution, right? And that's just not a great way to have to deal with bad policy. We need more flexibility.
So I want to ask one more question before we go to audience questions. We've been talking about the principle of federalism as between the sharing of power between the federal government and state governments. But I want to talk for a minute about that tug of war between state governments and local governments. So in Texas, the legislature just passed a bill that got dubbed the Death Star bill because it basically took away the power of local governments to regulate in any area that the state of Texas regulates in. And in a panel discussion in Austin on Friday, the mayor of San Antonio said, this issue is now the front line in the battle for democracy because this bill taking away power of local governments is really handing power to big money donors. So I know it's not exactly the principle of federalism. I believe the principle is subsidiarity. But talk a little bit, anybody who's interested, in this tug of war between state legislatures and city governments.
So it's exactly the same in many ways. And when we're talking federal to state and state to local, we used to joke in the legislature that, you know, if you wanted to get something passed, you would argue it in the name of local control or kids or veterans. So you'd always make those arguments. And the idea is that who's against kids, right? And who's against our veterans? And who's against local control? It's a healthy balance. The checks and balances hopefully aren't the third branch of government, the courts. Texas is a little, you know, shoot from the hip and ask questions later, as I understand it. In Montana, we like to say Montana is what Texas wants to be when it grows up, but we're just up the mountain range. But I think it's the same thing, and that healthy interaction between the local. I mean, I can tell you, it was easier being a statewide elected official than a local official. People are really passionate about local politics. And so if that is unbalanced and the local people are getting screwed, that, in my experience, that pendulum usually comes back. They get allies in the state, they get allies in the courts. The media is almost always with them. And it may not happen immediately, but almost always, you know, I would bet on those little old ladies that are pissed off because they didn't get what they wanted as compared to a statewide effort. But, you know, everybody wants to win now and today, and that's just not the way it is, and for good reason. So I can't speak to that issue, but I know that it's the same everywhere.
It's the same. And is this particularly an issue where outside money is dominating politics at the state legislature?
I think in some instances, there is a lot of outside money that's coming in. And, you know, I'm familiar with what happened in Florida around the time of the pandemic, where you used to hear people talking about local control and the virtues of that. But then suddenly, the ability of local school districts to go their own way in response to the pandemic was basically taken off the table. And quite honestly, I'm not gonna like take a side in that. I actually think there are are reasonable minds that can differ about like what is the proper level for a decision to be made. And I think the pandemic was one of those things where like you were constantly battling over, is this a state, like should the state have a mandate? Should it be up to the localities, or should the federal government? And so that's not going to go away. But when we have a better handle on the flow of money in the system, I think what you'll find is that the local voices are able to be heard over the currently drowning volume of the national money, right? And so that, I think, is only going to be a healthy situation for America.
Okay. All right, it's time for us to go to audience questions. I think we have a mic being passed around. So please wait and ask your question when the mic comes to you. And just a reminder to everybody, question ends with a question mark. It's short, so thank you very much. And speak right into the microphone, please, sir.
How about this? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Secretary, I want you to promise to take me to the Dutton Ranch next time I visit Montana. That's not my question. I love this. I love this. I'm right with you. Who doesn't love this? My question is, how do you get from where we are today to this, right? I like your answer about politician by politician, but I want to get here before we all expire from climate change. And we all know that Democrats and Republicans rely on contributions from PAC and Super PAC and Cock Money and Coach. Anyway.
Right. So how do we get here?
Wait a second. We rely on that money, and the politicians do, and we need a 2/3 vote from Congress to make this happen. And yet, they're all bound to the pharmaceutical industry, to the oil and gas industry, to stay in office. And who among them is going to say, I don't need this money?
Hey, sir, let's let them answer the question. Thank you. Brian.
No, I really appreciate that question. I'll give a quick answer because I could go on for a long time about how we're getting it done. So, two things. I just want everybody in this room to remember the results of some recent public opinion polling that we just released yesterday. So we polled nationally, and when you ask about support for this amendment, and we asked, would you support a constitutional amendment that allows the states and Congress to regulate money in our elections? Over 75% support, and that does not differ by political party. It's 73+% Republicans, 75+% Democrats, and like almost 80% unaffiliated. So the reason I bring that up is I am not debating what you said, which is that we have an activation energy issue. Like we've got to get them over the hump. But the way to do that is by mobilizing the people who we know are with us. Like the American people at the grassroots, they're not the way the folks in the federal legislature are. At the grassroots, they are with us. We have our volunteers here at fairs and festivals. It doesn't matter what party, they support this. And so when we mobilize those folks in every single state, because we got to get 2/3 of Congress and 38 states to ratify, we're doing it the way it's always happened in American history. The power of the people become irresistible to the people that are in power. And we're going to be getting pledges from candidates, and the fact is people are going to have to decide, are you going to continue to support somebody who doesn't stand with you on this, or are you going to look for somebody else to support? It's not easy, but that's why we need you to join us.
All right, thank you for the question. Next question, speak right in the microphone.
Stephen, I just heard you mention that we do not have a national voter registration system. And I'd like for you to tell me a little bit more about ERIC. Are you familiar with ERIC, the Election Voter Registration Information? So I thought that was a national registry.
So ERIC is a system that states can join, and they share certain data reports with each other. They're anonymized, and then they can search for duplications in those partnering states. But it is by no means required, and in fact, it's currently in the process of shrinking. As mentioned, Texas recently left, Tennessee recently left, Louisiana recently left. I'm not sure that's the way we should be going towards a national voter registration database, but it would solve a lot of the issues and questions that are posed to me, and I think a surprising number of people want a national voter registration database or are surprised that we don't have a national voter registration database.
All right. Next question.
Hello. The amendment text, do you believe when it's part of the Constitution that states or federal regulating the identity of donors, real party of interest, would definitely be constitutional?
Sorry, I couldn't. Regulating the what? Sorry, regulating.
So the transparency part.
Yeah, disclosure.
Disclosure, do you believe your text is strong enough to withstand the constitutional arguments around freedom of association that will be raised when someone goes to court and says, I shouldn't have to disclose my donations?
So the answer is yes. And the reason why, I think, to answer the previous question, is I think as a nation we have to acknowledge that in 2010 the Supreme Court was wrong. So that's a big thing, right? We need to come to that, understand it both from the left and right, that the Supreme Court was wrong, that unlimited, undocumented money does not equal free speech. And so, right there, you know, we can talk about corporations are not people. For tax purposes, that's great. I get it on your 1040s and all of that. We can deal with that in a different level. But the two aspects, in my mind, how this passes and how we don't have to do a whole lot of new stuff, it's already existing. Transparency and disclosure, meaningful disclosure, is already there. If we recognize and unhitch this 2010 concept that you can do whatever you want, unlimited money, untraceable money, for all practical purposes, because a lot of times you can't find out that, even when you can trace it, it's 6 months after the outcome already happened. Good luck getting somebody out of office once they already won it. So unlimited money does not equal free speech. The Supreme Court was wrong with Citizens United, and I think everyone in America kind of knows that. And if we don't beat each other up trying to tit for tat and win games and back up and say, look, courts make mistakes too, let's figure out how to fix it. For Our Freedom is a step in how you do that, which basically let's get this back to the states. Let's redo this. Let's figure out how we're going to go forward so that the best people can come forward. I don't think there's any hindrance on disclosure. I don't think that already exists. The problem now is money.
So, Brian, as a constitutional law scholar, do you agree that disclosure would be constitutional after this amendment's ratified?
Yeah, completely. And I'll just I'll tie it to the language really briefly, but I want to just level set for people here. There have been a number of cases where that argument about anonymous spending is somehow protected, a protected right by the First Amendment. And you know who said that that was hogwash? Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia said the founders would be rolling over in their graves to imagine us living in a society where we were campaigning anonymously because somehow that was our First Amendment right. So in Section 2, we say nothing in this Constitution, nothing else in the Constitution shall be construed to forbid reasonable regulation, which includes transparency and disclosure measures. So in this instance, we're trying to make good on what Justice Scalia said in 3 or 4 different cases.
That's good branding.
I think we have time for one more question. Who's got the mic?
Hi.
Speak right into the mic.
How would this affect, if at all, things like the FEC versus Ted Cruz for Senate? Would this have any effect on...
I'm sorry, could you get the mic closer to your mouth? I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. How would this affect, if at all, things like the FEC versus Ted Cruz for Senate? Would it affect repayment aspects of campaigns or just in accruing funds for campaigns?
So I won't get into the weeds with that case, but basically in FEC versus Cruz, the issue there was like you could be running for Senate and the election could already happen, and then you could continue to raise money to basically help pay off the debts that you would incurred from like a personal loan to your campaign before the election. So it's almost as clear an opportunity for like conventional quid pro quo kind of corruption. But again, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do anything about it. We are confident that with the language of our amendment, the FEC and Congress, which passes the laws that the FEC then implements the rules, Congress would be able to create a rule that prevents exactly that kind of issue from happening ever again. But it's a great question.
Okay, we have a minute and a half left, so a very short question, please.
What elected officials that have high profile and influence have already come out in support or close enough that we can put the pressure for them to do so, that are currently in office?
I think the question was like, who are some people that we can put the pressure on to?
Who are people?
Who are people already? So this is a great way for me to plug some of our panelists for tomorrow. So tomorrow, Thursday, I think it's at 3:30, we're going to have a panel on For Our Freedom Amendment in the States. And you're going to hear from bipartisan state legislators, leaders in their states that have gotten behind this amendment. And the state legislators are absolutely crucial to what we're doing because, going back to Stephen's point, they are closer to the people. They have, honestly, right now, a bit more courage than their federal counterparts to say, you know what, this isn't working for my constituents. I don't care what Party X or Party Y has said about this in the past. I know what's right now. So it's our state legislators that we should be speaking to and asking them to sort of step up and fight with us on this. And also, if you happen to have a direct line to about 67 members of the U.S. Senate, you know, let's get on a Zoom with them.
He only has 65.
So with that, I invite you to attend the other American Promise panels. Today at 4 o'clock in the Justice Room, the Constitution still belongs to us. A new amendment era is here. And we'll find out why the conditions in America are ripe right now for a new era of change. Tomorrow at 3:30 in Change Makers A, for the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment in the states and across America. And then Thursday, we have also Thursday at 3:30, How to Amend the Constitution, an inside look at our strategy, tactics, and methods, which goes to the first question that we had today. So I want to thank the panelists and the audience members. Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ann.